This is Democracy Watch. Mark, this is a video that I've wanted to record with you for quite a long time. I'm especially concerned as we are watching Mike Johnson refuse to swear in Representative-elect Adelita Grijalva that his unwillingness to actually go ahead and swear in a Democratic member of Congress could be kind of him testing the fence and laying the groundwork here to refuse to swear in any Democratic members of Congress as we look toward 2026 and beyond. And so to what extent do you think that this serves as a blinking red light as we look forward into Republicans continuing to execute this broader scheme of refusing to, allow any Democrats to serve in government?
Yeah. So look, I get this question a lot, and I understand the concern. And believe me, I worry about everything. I game out every possibility. And for people who don't know, this situation has arisen because a Democrat won this special election, as Brian said, and the House has been sort of out of session because Mike Johnson doesn't want to swear this member-elect in because she would provide the last signature or vote necessary to release the Epstein files, right? So that's why you hear people refer to where we're at right now as the Epstein shutdown, because the Republicans in the House literally won't reconvene and allow this person to be sworn in, because if they're sworn in, then the next thing you know, the Epstein files are going to have to be voted on or released, and they don't want that happening. So that's like the backstory. And the reason why I start with that, Brian, is that is not a backstory that we're going to have very often, right? Typically, the House is not out of session for months on end. The fact is that we should all be highlighting the fact that Republicans in the House are simply not doing their job. You want to know why the government is shut down? Well, one of the reasons the government is shut down is because Mike Johnson won't have the House Republicans show up to work at all. So, it's a very unusual fact pattern. The state of Arizona and the member-elect have gone to court, and basically they are relying on a case from 1969 called Powell v. McCormick, which basically says if you meet all of the criteria that the Constitution sets out, the age requirements, and you've been elected and all of that to serve in the House of Representatives, then the House can't refuse to seat you. That, in a nutshell, if you meet the constitutional requirements for being a member of Congress, you can't be denied a seat as a member of Congress because the House Speaker doesn't like you, or for some unrelated thing. That they can ultimately move to expel you, but that's a higher threshold of vote count. So that's what they're relying on. The flip side is that I think the House Republicans are going to say, and their response will be like, look, we're not in session. We have these pro forma sessions where we're in for 3 minutes at a time, but we're not in session, and the House Speaker controls the floor. And so the House Speaker hasn't said, I'm not going to swear in the member-elect. He's just said, I'm not going to swear her in now. And so that's, I think, a fair presentation of what the two sides are. In terms of the precedential effect, the thing that people need to remember is that the House, unlike the Senate, is not a continuing body. What does that mean? The Senate never actually loses all of its membership. There is always some number of senators who are still in their term. That is not true in the House. When we get to next January, every member-elect who appears before the clerk of the House for swearing in will be just that. They will be members-elect. They won't be automatically members of the new Congress. So, Mike Johnson will have tools available to him to make mischief. He'll have tools available to him to try to muck up the gears, but he actually won't be the person swearing in new members at the beginning of next January. That's done by the clerk. Right now, the speaker-elect plays a ceremonial role there, but it is ultimately not in the position of the House Speaker to make that decision then. And that's really, a different situation.
Okay, so in light of what you said, given the latitude that Mike Johnson has, how are you thinking about the possibility of success of Attorney General Chris Mays' lawsuit against Mike Johnson?
Look, in cases like this, you can never know for sure. I mean, these things just don't come up that often. On the one hand, Mays has the precedent of Powell v. McCormick, which says, someone who is duly elected, who meets all of the constitutional requirements, can't be refused to be sworn in. On the other hand, the Speaker we'll point to the fact that he is a constitutional officer who controls the House of Representatives, and courts have been extremely deferential and said that essentially they cannot order the House of Representatives on how it governs itself. So these are what are referred to sometimes as political questions, right? The seating or the non-seating of members is kind of a political question. So you have like these two precedent which kind of bump up against each other, and we'll see what the courts say. I think the important thing for people to know is that this really is an outlier situation. So I don't want people thinking that what happens here precedentially is going to necessarily control what is going to happen next January when we're talking about a new slate of members of Congress, or even what this case would look like, by the way, if the House comes back into session. I mean, I think this case would look very different from the standpoint of Mays if the House came back into session and a week or two went by and they were still not swearing her in. Right, because then the House then it looks a lot more like Powell v. McCormick, right, where the House Speaker is just saying, "I'm not swearing her in." The problem that Mays has right now is that isn't Mike Johnson's position. Mike Johnson's position is not, "I'm not swearing in the member elect." Mike Johnson's position is, we are in pro forma session. Literally nothing is happening. We are not voting on anything. She's not missing any votes because we're not voting. And so there's no, the court can't tell us whether it has to be a Sunday or next Tuesday that we swear her in, particularly when the House is not in session.
Well, the pushback to that is going to be, okay, but he swore in two members during pro forma sessions anyway, so didn't he undermine his ability to say that not being in session is adequate justification to not swear a member in?
Yeah, I think that this goes to the question of which perspective you view it from. Do you view it from the perspective of that Mike Johnson needs a justification, or do you view it from the perspective of the plaintiff needs an exigency, right? Like the question is like, what's the status quo? Who is the one that is trying to say the other needs to yield? And I think, obviously the member-elect and Mike Johnson and Chris Mays, the Attorney General of Arizona, would say, look, she still can be doing constituent services. And so it's not true there's no harm for her not having been sworn in. She doesn't have the resources of the House of Representatives to represent her constituents in ways that aren't voting on the floor. And that's, I think, their best argument. Mike Johnson's argument on the other side is like, look, the session, yes, we have done pro forma swearing in because it was a convenient scheduling for the member-elect. It was convenient for me, Mike Johnson, but that doesn't create a right for a member-elect, a new member-elect, to commandeer the floor of the House for their ceremony, essentially. That ceremony can be at our convenience, not at their demand. And I'm watching this from the sidelines. I'm watching the arguments on both sides. I'll wait to see what the trial courts say, and then whether this goes up to the Court of Appeals and maybe even the Supreme Court. What I suspect is going to happen is that this case will eventually moot itself. It may be the trial court rules or doesn't yet even rule, but at some point, the House of Representatives will have to come back into session. And when it does, then I think Mike Johnson, then either Mike Johnson's going to swear them in, or it's going to be a very different lawsuit. It's going to have a much different veneer to it, because then the member-elect will say, look, I'm missing votes on legislation.
Is there some concern that let's jump ahead and say worst case scenario? The most cynical view of this is that the Republicans may be testing the fence here to see how much they can get away with in terms of not swearing in members because, they've committed the crime of having a D next to their name. Is there any concern that with the Attorney General of Arizona's lawsuit being put forward, that if, for the reasons that you laid out, Mike Johnson wins here and Representative-elect Adelita Grijalva loses and Chris Mays loses, that will serve as some pretext, flimsy and tenuous though it may be, some pretext for Mike Johnson and Trump and the Republicans to move forward and say, hey, this might actually be a tool that we have moving forward because now we've got some precedent here that we can point to where a judge says that we don't have to swear in members in a timely manner, and let's see how far we can get away with this.
Yeah, like I said, look, we are always balancing the risk reward ratio and calculus of like, if we bring a case and we win, what's the benefit? If we bring the case and we lose, what are the potential downside, downstream consequences of that? And I'm sure that AG Mays has made that calculation. I'm sure the representative-elect has made that calculation. Like I said, my suspicion is this won't have a lot of downstream effects because it's hard for me to imagine that this government shutdown goes on for so long that litigation jumps up from the district court to the Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court. We start to get really binding precedent. And even then, it will be a very odd case. I mean, I remember this when we were talking about doing this episode, and you're right, you've wanted to do this for some time. There was this very weird circumstance back when Rod Blagojevich was the governor of Illinois, and he was essentially auctioning off a U.S. Senate seat. It was quite unseemly. And he wound up appointing someone to the seat. And that person showed up at the Senate doors to be sworn in, and the Senate turned him back and said, nope, you don't have both signatures on your certificate of election. And he said, it doesn't matter. I was appointed by the governor. That's constitutional. That's a constitutional power. And your paperwork doesn't matter. And they said, too bad, you have to go get the paperwork. So they went back to the state. One of the Democratic, I think it was the Democratic Secretary of State, who was supposed to countersign the paperwork, said, I won't sign it. And that went to court. And there was, in fact, litigation about this issue about whether or not this person gets seated. And ultimately, the court held that the Secretary of State needed to sign the paperwork. They signed the paperwork. Then it came to the Senate and the person was seated. By then, kind of the political controversy around it had kind of moved on. The dialogue had moved on. It's still an important case. It's one I remember, but it's not one that comes up that often. Oftentimes these seating cases are kind of one-off. So look, do I worry that Mike Johnson will make bad faith use of anything? Yes, I do. I think he'll make bad faith use of anything he possibly can. That's what he's built to do. That's what Donald Trump does. Donald Trump lies every day. I'm worried about the election monitors in California, not because they're going to find fraud, but because Donald Trump will make bad faith use of whatever they do. So I worry about that all the time, but I'm optimistic, let's put it this way, that this case will not wind up defining the law in a meaningful way, that outside of the rhetorical use that Mike Johnson will make of it, that it will have otherwise binding consequences.
Well, look, I know I can speak for a lot of people in saying that in the event that this precedent is abused in any way, that I'm grateful that we have folks like you and your team that are standing by, ready to fight this thing, not only in the media, where it especially matters, that's why I do what I do, but also in the courts, in ground zero, where these battles are actually being fought. So one small step that everybody watching can take to support Mark's work and elevate his voice is to sign up for Democracy Docket. I'm going to put that link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I use it on a daily basis. If you're not yet signed up, trust me, do yourself a favor and sign up. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.